Hello, everybody. Welcome to our lecture on trophic cascades. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about what a trophic cascade is and to talk about some specific examples. Also excited to connect it to some of the content Professor Choate discussed last week about biodiversity and ecosystems. So let me get my screen pulled up and we'll go from there. All right, so when we're thinking about trophic cascades and the loss of biodiversity, so Professor Choate highlighted that, we are really in this middle of this sixth mass extinction. We're losing a lot of species. And when we lose species, we're not just losing those individual animals, but we're losing the interaction between the species. And those species interactions are really critical to shaping what that ecosystem looks like. And so it's really critical when we think about the loss of biodiversity. We look at the loss of potential trophic cascades as well. And so these are the discussion questions that I want you guys to think about as we work through this lecture and at the end. These will guide our discussion in class and are also possible exam questions as well. So the first thing that I want you guys to do is look at this picture of the Earth, this colored picture of the Earth from space. And think about things that you notice about this picture. Maybe you notice that our Earth is made up of a lot of water, right? We see a lot of blue color, a lot of oceans, where that darker blue indicates deeper ocean. The lighter blue indicates a more shallow ocean, which makes sense, closer to the equator. And you also might notice that when it comes to the land masses, we see a lot of green area. And we often ask this question, this is kind of a famous question in ecology, is why is the world green, right? We have all these species that eat plants, right? These herbivore species, these consumers of primary producers, right? We talked about primary producers last week. So even though we have all of these herbivore species, why is the world still green? And so in 1960, three scientists proposed this question, right? Why is the world green? And it resulted in what's known as this green world hypothesis in 1960. And the question, the research question guiding this hypothesis was, why don't animals eat all the available food, right? So if there's so much available plant matter, why don't they eat it all, and turn the world to brown, right? So why don't animals eat all the available food, changing the green world to a brown world? And the answer to that question, or the proposed reasoning to that question, is that the herbivores are not food limited. In other words, there's a great availability of food, which we know by this massive green color, but they're limited by predator species. In other words, predators really control these food chains by keeping the number of herbivores or consumers of plants down to a stable level. And this is what's known as a trophic cascade, right? This is a top-down effect. A top-down effect is those effects that start at the top of a food chain. So thinking about those secondary carnivores or the top carnivore in the food chain. And those top-down effects are known as trophic cascades. And trophic cascades have become a really important concept in science. And you can tell this by looking at this figure on the number of articles on the x-axis and the years on the y-axis. So you can see that starting in about 2000, there were over 50 articles produced each year on freshwater trophic cascades. And that number has just exponentially increased, right? We can see that on terrestrial ecosystems, so those green dotted. In 2014, there were over 350 articles in 1 year talking about trophic cascades. And trophic cascades, the word trophic cascade came around in the 1980s by a estuarine ecologist known as Robert Payne. And so he was really the first one in recent times to describe how predators can structure communities. And he's the one that really coined the term trophic cascade. However, the concept of trophic cascade really started much earlier than this. There's parts in The Origin of the Species, which is the famous book written by Charles Darwin, where he talks about the role of feral cats keeping the populations of mice down, because without the feral cats, the mice eat a lot of honeycombs, and it really influences the pollinator community in that area. And so Charles Darwin talked about the role of feral cats and mice and bees. Aldo Leopold, in his book, Aldo Leopold's really a famous wildlife management scientist. He has a book known as called Thinking Like a Mountain, and he wrote about the role of wolves keeping the white-tailed deer populations in check. And that really, in order to see this, that you have to think like a mountain, right? In other words, you have to understand that the mountain can't survive without a control on the white-tailed deer. Otherwise, the white-tailed deer will just eat and eat and eat. And so Charles Darwin and Aldo Leopold really talked about this concept of trophic cascades, but Robert Payne was really the first one to introduce it. And we'll talk a little bit about his research. And so when we think about these top-down effects, right, these effects that start at the top of the food chain, we think about predators, right? So some common predators here in the United States include mountain lions. Let me backtrack. I say common predators, but really these predators don't have high population numbers. So a better way to think about it would be the most known, well-known predators. Include things like the mountain lion. The mountain lion is a species that stalks its prey. It really hunts alone in one individual animal. A gray wolf is another example of a predator in the United States. Gray wolves are pack species. They hunt in packs as opposed to mountain lions. And then the American alligator, another example. American alligators are solo hunters. They are a sit and wait type of predator where they just hang out in the water really, really still until a prey swims by and they kind of make their attack then. But there are other lesser known voracious predators in our ecosystems, right? We have things like the American robin, which consumes worms, very voracious predator. Same thing with the common shrew. Common shrews are insectivores, so they eat a lot of insects. And the American woodcock, another species, a bird species that is considered a really voracious predator. So we think about predators in these top-down effects. We're not just talking about these charismatic vertebrae, large vertebrae species or large carnivore species. We can also think about species that eat things like insects, for example, or worms in the case of the American robin. And so back to that idea of discovering these trophic cascades with Dr. Robert Payne. And so Robert Payne was really one of these influential ecologists on trophic cascades. And he studied trophic cascades on the coast of Washington. Much of early evidence from trophic cascades were from aquatic systems. Aquatic systems tend to have a much more simple food chain than terrestrial ecosystems. And they're a lot easier to manipulate in a lot of ways. And so basically what Robert Payne did, he went along the intertidal coast of Washington. And what I mean by intertidal is that at times during the day, the water is really high, and at other times as the tide goes out, the water level drops. And those are known as intertidal zones. Well, he noticed that there were areas of those intertidal zones that lacked starfish. And then there were areas of those intertidal zones that had starfish. And then he started counting the other number of species that were available there. And so in diagram A, in a ecosystem that has starfish, in one of those tidal ecosystems that have starfish, you can see the complexity of that web. And you can see that the starfish eats those sea anemones. And as a result, those sea anemones and tourniquets, they are really a much lower in population. And so they don't really have much as impact on the benthic algae, for example. And then the starfish also help to keep the number of barnacles down and the number of chitons down, right? And so in these areas with starfish, there were more species, a more complex web. Webs that are more complex tend to be more stable. And that's an important fact. That's one of our discussion points. In those areas where he removed the starfish or the starfish were absent, we have a much more simple food web here, right? We have mussels that are very abundant because there's no predator keeping those mussels down, as opposed to the left side where we only have a few mussels. We have only one species of an epitite, and those carnivorous gastropods are much more frequent as well, and those result in fewer barnacles. And so you can see that these trophic cascades, they start from the top, and this is the definition of a trophic cascade. Trophic cascades are those indirect species interactions that originate with predators and spread downward through the food web. And so these indirect species interactions can involve things like predator-prey relationships, influencing the behavior of another species, resulting in lesser abundance of a third species. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but there's the definition of a trophic cascade. Another example of a trophic cascade is from the Isle Royale National Park. And so here we have a 3-level food system, okay? And what I mean by that is we know that Professor Choate last week talked about those food chains. We could have a 5-level food chain, a 4-level food chain, a 3-level food chain. In this case, it's a 3-level trophic system. We have the gray wolf, we have a moose, and we have a balsam fir. And those italicized words in parentheses next to the species names are those scientific names of the species. So it's a genus species. So wolves are Canis lupus, moose are Alces alces, and you get the point there. All right, so in Isle Royale National Park, it's this island in the middle of Lake Superior. So we can see kind of the upper peninsula of Michigan there. We can see Ontario and Canada, and then Minnesota. So Isle Royale is an island, and this makes it a really good place to study these predator-prey dynamics because it's isolated. And in other words, you can really control the external effects. And so let's look at some data from this to determine if a trophic cascade occurred in this area. So before I show you the data, let's think about what we want to look at here. We want to look at the impact on wolves, on moose, and then moose on balsam fir. One way that you can tell how healthy a balsam fir is by looking at the tree ring data. And so you guys have probably all looked at a tree cookie before. That's a cookie is just a slice of this tree, and you can determine the tree's age by counting those rings. But you can also determine how healthy the tree was in that season by looking at how wide those rings are. In other words, really skinny rings indicates that the tree was under stress. Right? This makes sense. When we're under stress, we don't have as much energy. We're not putting that energy towards growth, if we imagine we're a tree. And so we can see here that under those rainy seasons in that tree cookie, we have a wider growth. That means the tree is doing better. Skinnier rings, the tree is not doing as well. And so let's look at some data here. All right, so here we have our data. On the top, we have our wolves. Our wolf populations, you'll notice that it goes from about 15 to 60. The moose population is the figure below that. Notice the discrepancy in the x-axis, right? Predators tend to have a much lower abundance or lower number of individuals as opposed to herbivores or their prey. So in here we have the moose. They go from 400 to about 1,600. And then those two figures below are looking at the tree ring data. And so a wider MM, so up there by 0.6, that means that the rings are larger. That means the tree was being more healthy that year. Smaller growth rings indicate the tree is not doing as healthy. The west indicates the west side of the island, the east indicates the east side of the island. And so in this case, they got data from both the west and the east side of the island. So let's look at an example. Let's look at the purple stars under the wolf population. So the wolf population with the purple star, it says it's about at 18 wolves or so. So we have a low wolf population. Let's follow that down. The purple star at the moose, we have a high moose population. So when there's a low number of wolves, there's a high number of moose. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of a lag effect, right? This lag just refers to that impact of these predator-prey relationships sometimes takes some time to impact. It doesn't happen in that year. In this case, it happened maybe the year after that. So we have low wolf numbers, high moose numbers. If there's a higher number of moose, they're putting more stress on the trees, right? They're munching on the tree leaves, they're eating it, they're eating those leaves. Those leaves can't be used for photosynthesis, right? Professor Choate talked about photosynthesis last week. Well, if the moose are eating all the leaves, there's not going to be as many leaves to capture all that sun energy and turn that energy into growth. And so we have a low moose, or I'm sorry, a low wolf, a high moose, a small growth, right? We're at about 0.4 there for both the west and the east side. And we can look at that same relationship with those yellow stars. And so what does this tell us? Is there evidence for a trophic cascade? And in this case, there is evidence for a trophic cascade. The food chain appears to be tightly linked with a top-down control, low wolf density, high moose density, ring growth suppression, evidence for a trophic cascade. All right, let's look at another example involving wolves and Yellowstone National Park. So Yellowstone National Park was our first national park that was established in the United States. It was established in 1872. And the gray wolves existed in the national park until about the late 1800s, where they were basically eradicated through trapping and shooting. So the gray wolf, the food chain, the food web in Yellowstone is a little bit more complex. In other words, there are other top predators, things like the grizzly bear, things like the mountain lion. But those top predators have different strategies of hunting, right? Mountain lions are solo hunters. They're stalkers. They stalk their prey, whereas gray wolves hunt in packs. Grizzly bears are omnivores, so they will eat meat, but they'll also eat things like berries and mushrooms and everything. So gray wolves are really the only predator of the elk that has a real direct impact throughout the year. So in this case, we have a 3-level trophic system, so very similar to what we had in the Isle Royale. But here we're talking about gray wolves and elk, and then quaking aspen and willow. So the elk munch on quaking aspen, they munch on the willow, they keep the growth down of those species when the gray wolf isn't in the area. So, and then that map there shows where Yellowstone is located, kind of in that northeastern portion of Wyoming. It also goes a little bit into Idaho, a little bit into Montana. All right, so let's look at our evidence here of a trophic cascade in Yellowstone National Park. The first thing I want to draw your attention to are those images in the center. And so we have an image of 1949. This was mid wolf decimation, right? There pretty much were no wolves in the park in the mid 1900s. You can see that impact of not having wolves there in 1988, almost 40 years later, right? We have no trees growing. We have barely any bushes growing. And then in 2004, we start to see a regrowth of some of those willows. So there's a little bit of visual evidence, but let's look at some population data. So in 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park after being extirpated from that region for over 50 years. So gray wolves really weren't around that park for about 50 to 75 years. In 1995, they brought in 15 wolves and released them into the park. And so we can see here our timeline on the x-axis in 1995. And the population of the wolves in square A, the elk in square B, and then the height of aspen in our square D. And so in 1995, the wolves were reintroduced. We started with about 15 to 20 wolves there roaming the land in 1996. We can see that the elk, that's population in thousands. So an elk population in 1995 was about 15,000 in the park. As we see the wolf population start to increase, so let's look at 2000. So in year 2000, we had about 40 wolves in the population in the park. Our elk population started to decrease a little bit. Now we're at about 14,000 or so. All right, and then we can look at our aspen height. Our aspen height in about 2000 is about 50 centimeters. So, we're starting to see a little bit of an effect, but really not that big yet. Okay, then we can look ahead another 10 years or so. So maybe let's look at 2004 when we had a really high wolf population. We had 100 wolves in the area. That resulted in a decrease in elk, but by about 5,000. We had about 10,000 elk in 2004. And we can see when the elk are low, we're starting to get a higher height in aspen. In other words, the elk aren't, number one, there's not enough elk to keep that aspen at a low height, right? They browse from the top down. And so do we have evidence of a trophic cascade? Yes. The other impact of trophic cascades are these indirect effects, these knock-on effects. And so trophic cascade always starts from the top, right? It always starts with a predator, top-down impacts. Knock-on effects are not trophically downward. They spin off on the main interaction, and they actually can start at the bottom. So one knock-on effect of the wolves and the elk and the more willows was that we started to see an increase of beaver population. So we can see here in 2004, our beaver population went from about 3-4 beavers pre-wolf reintroduction to about 10 beaver colonies. Those are beaver colonies. So about 5 to 6 beavers live in a colony, maybe more. And so this comeback of the beavers is a knock-on effect, right? It started with the willows being back. The beavers had more food. They had more resources to build their dams with, their lodges, right, where they live and have young. And also with the increase of willows, we started to see more songbirds. Willows provide habitat for songbirds for their nesting. It provides cover, it provides protection from the elements and protection from predators. And so these figures down in the bottom right are just abundance of these predators. And you can see that between the suppressed, which means that there's barely any willows, to the released, we see this increase. And so these are examples of knock-on effects of trophic cascades, right? These effects that are not trophically downward, but they are a result of a trophic cascade. And we're going to ask you guys to watch a video of how wolves change rivers to really illustrate this effect. So I gave examples of two 3-level food chains, right? And so when we're thinking about these 3-level food chains and the impact that the predators can have on the herbivores and the impact of the herbivores on the primary producer, right? The length of the food chain matters. And so we have this inverse relationship between adjacent pairs of trophic levels. And so let's look at this bottom left figure. If we just have one trophic level, just plants, right? We have a large number of plants. That makes sense. There's nothing to eat the plants. If we have 2 trophic levels, we have just herbivores and plants, big number of herbivores, small number of plants, right? That would lead us to a brown world. But in a green world, we have these 3-level trophic systems, right? Where we have a primary carnivore keeping the role of these herbivores down, the abundance of these herbivores down, large number of plants. We can also have these 4-level trophic systems as well. We see these inverse relationships. So let's look at this in practice. So here we have a 3-level trophic system of sea otters, So here we have a picture of a sea otter. We have an otter number on the x-axis. Sea otters eat urchins, right? If you've seen a picture of a sea otter floating around. Here's my otter here, floating around with the sea urchin on its belly, eating it, right? Sea urchins are eaten by otters really frequently. And then we have kelp systems. So sea urchins eat kelp. Kelp are really important for the forest floor. And so when we have a high number of otters, we have a low sea urchin biomass. So in other words, there's not a lot of sea urchins. We have a low grazing intensity on the sea urchins on the kelp, and we have a high number of kelp. So think about the knock-on effects of the habitat kelp can provide for other species. However, we're seeing a shift in this food chain. We're seeing a shift from a 3-trophic system to a 4-trophic system. And in environments where 4-trophic systems were natural and those environments evolved in 4-trophic systems, we don't see much of an impact, maybe as we do here. But killer whales normally hunt seals and sea lions, but seal and sea lions populations are starting to collapse, primarily because their food source is getting overfished. We're also seeing an increase in ocean temperature due to climate change. And so seals and sea lions aren't able to find their typical prey. As a result, the sea lion and seal numbers are going down, and killer whales are shifting food sources. So killer whales are starting to eat sea otters. As a result, there's less sea otters, more sea urchin biomass, our grazing intensity increases, and our total kelp density decreases. And so you can see here in this picture with sea otters versus without sea otters, right? With sea otters, we have these kelp forests, really important for maintaining habitat for a variety of species. Without sea otters, we don't have this. And so this is another example of a trophic cascade, both with the sea otters and the introduction of the killer whales into the area. So I illustrated a few examples of trophic cascades. These are fairly simplified, right? We know that ecosystems are super complex. Some of those food chains and food webs that Professor Choate showed, right, have a lot of interactions. And so in some areas, it's easier to study, right? In areas where predators are reintroduced, like Yellowstone, it provides a really good study system. And really, we talk primarily about carnivores and the roles, but think about those other predators as well, the American robins or beetles. Beetles are voracious predators to insects. And so we're not thinking just about charismatic carnivore species, although they do help to illustrate a good example. And so the time scale is dependent on which species we're really focusing on. And so trophic cascades can really impact biodiversity of an ecosystem. And so we want to think about when we are prioritizing ecosystem preservation or ecosystem management, which ecosystems do we focus on? Should we look at reintroducing more predators to the landscape? Right, moving beyond a single species management to conserving the integrity of these food webs. Right? And so thinking about these interconnected food webs, we want really complex food webs. They're more stable as opposed to really simple food webs. And so maybe that involves reintroducing predators to terrestrial systems. And part of that isn't just releasing predators on the landscape, right? It takes a lot of human interaction as well to be successful. And so again, here are those discussion questions I want you guys to think about. These are possible exam questions. These will also guide our questions for class discussions. So look forward to chatting more about this topic with you. See ya next time.